Guys, I'm DW. I have won 3 majors in CSGO, and this is Thorin's YouTube channel.
Chinese players AttackeR and Summer, formerly known as Fancy One, have rejoined TyLoo, the top Chinese team, the best Asian team in general. These two players were previously playing for Flash Gaming, a squad that they formed after breaking away from TyLoo it was February of 2017 that they officially left. At the time, the news actually was that a whole bunch of the TyLoo players were going to go because AttackeR and Summer left. Somebody was suspended by TyLoo for somehow being involved with contact with another organization, potentially leaving. And Karsa, who at the time was the coach of TyLoo, but later went on to be the player and in-game leader of Flash Gaming, was fired outright, presumably for helping facilitate this deal and being an organizational member of staff, at the same time as trying to leave and join a different team. Now, this wasn't a big deal in the West. People just saw it as, oh, these players wanted to leave. They wanted to go and make a different team. At the time, people were dubbing the Flash Gaming team as like an attempt to make a super team from China, even though, quite frankly, it was weaker than the previous TyLoo. TyLoo itself, later on, obviously, they were able to replace these players with people like Benter. Greb became much, much better than Flash Gaming. It didn't work out, but that wasn't the big deal. The big deal in China was this whole angle of, they were under contract with TyLoo, so how dare they speak to other teams. They have a very different sense of poaching rules there. If you're a European and you follow European sports, this might sound crazy, the idea you can't even talk to the other team. Never mind you sign a contract, just talk to them hey, I'd like to come here next season. This is kind of an American thing though from traditional sports, the idea of poaching. In Asia, it goes more along the lines, quite frankly, with the idea that the teams think of themselves as owning these players. This is my property. You don't talk to my player without my permission. You're my player. You don't talk to anyone else until this contract's ended. And since they have something called ACE there, which is the Chinese esports association, their version of KESPA, as it were, or on some very low level, WISA, because obviously WISA is nothing like KESPA in terms of the scope and actual global scale, but it's its own little affinity group or association of certain teams and power structure within Europe at least. So, in terms of this move, that caused a lot of controversy in the Chinese scene. A lot of fans were hating on these players in particular and called them traitors, pieces of shit, kind of hating on them. But now they come, they rejoin, they're back in the fold, and basically we're back to a somewhat similar lineup of TyLoo, right? So let's start with this move in general, because obviously these players aren't just coming in and occupying empty seats. 2 players have been removed, have been released. These are Captain Mo, long-time captain and player for TyLoo. We're talking about from the end of 1.6 to now. DD has also been released. These are the 2 players that they've kicked out the team. I think generally these were the right move. In terms of Captain Mo, absolutely, categorically the right move. He'd been pretty bad individually for a while now. He was already a guy who wanted to use the AWP a lot, which is a lot of resources to invest in as someone who wasn't very good in 2018. He was injured for a decent part of 2018, which is why when they attended events like CSGO Asia Championship, where actually TyLoo was very important, quite frankly, was a team that showed quite a lot of potential. They were attending with a stand-in in place of Mo. They had a guy called AE at the time. Now, I think, okay, yes, Captain Mo was a veteran. Captain Mo is at this point in time a legendary figure within the Chinese scene. He was the in-game leader of TyLoo at certain points in time. He helped them to accomplish that amazing first big upset over Luminosity Gaming, the champions of the major, a week after MLG Columbus when they were at DreamHack Masters Malmo. But he wasn't a good player in 2018. He was injured most of the time. He's not considered a top Chinese player anymore, and he wasn't even the in-game leader of the team because due to his injuries, Benter took over that role of being a star player and an in-game leader, something of a Nico-esque move by Benter. So removing Mo is a slam dunk for me. It's an obvious one. The team was so good even without him. If anything, with him, they didn't look much better. It didn't look like he brought that much to the squad. I'm actually thinking it's the right move. I'm glad this move was made. The DD one, I'm a bit more torn on. Because over the years, I thought he was kind of a sleeper player for those teams. He actually, if you go way back to the early days, was one of the better players internationally. The problem they had as a team was they stomped so hard domestically that it was very tough to tell just from domestic player who's actually legit. So I was always looking and isolating just either when they played tier 2 and tier 3 teams like the Epsilons and Heroics when they went over there in 2016, or when they just went to big international tournaments or Western tournaments in general. I looked primarily just at that. And quite frankly, actually, DD and Somebody were the two most legit players out of that original TyLoo lineup for my money in terms of competing against the best players in the world. Because it's very different to play someone who's less skilled than you of the same skill level and to play someone who's better than you. How do you play when you have disadvantages? When he can counter a lot of things that you do, when you can't be as sloppy, can't be as slapdash and expect to still succeed, and especially not overpower someone with just your aim. You're probably not going to do that if you're playing against the best players in the world and you are just one of the best Chinese players who at the moment haven't shown the ability to be at that level. Now, in terms of the players they've replaced those two with, AttackeR, this is the one where I think it's fairly obvious this is the right move, because in Flash Gaming, he was the best player in the team, quite frankly. He can be a good fragger. He was one of the better TyLoo players when he was in TyLoo, but he could be very up and down. I think that's in part due to his playing style. For me, AttackeR and Somebody were the players who were like super aggro, played very, very ham style, like looked as though, I'm not sure about AttackeR, but they both actually, to me, every time I watched them, looked like they had pretty high sensitivities, and they play around that, like trying to play off aim, trying to take crazy aim duels, get in people's faces. Like, these are the two guys who defined the better end of the TyLoo style for my money. And so bringing AttackeR back into the fold, I think with the current lineup of who they have in TyLoo, it's a great move. It makes a lot of sense to me. I think he can be a good fragger in this team. I think he upgrades the firepower, and I'm excited to see what happens with him back in TyLoo. Because as I alluded to before, for me, Flash Game was a waste of time pretty much the entire time it existed. Bringing back Sommer, formerly known as Fancy One, is the one I'm a little bit more kind of questioning. I know stats-wise, he's still one of the best Chinese players. He still even had some tournaments against Western teams or in the West that have been good. The problem is, it is hard to look past the history of the player who used to be known as Fancy One, which is when TyLoo first came around and started dominating the Asian scene, and then even going to lands and dominating them, and then finally started to play at the Asia Minor and at Western tournaments. Fancy One was the guy who had all the hype because he had the craziest stats. Online played against Chinese players, he looked like he was like, just in terms of stats and how far ahead he was, at times he looked like he was a Simple or a Nico of the Chinese scene. So obviously, people were very excited to see this guy play. Maybe he's going to do some of the shit we see from Oscar and Nico and Simple and these guys before they were in elite world-class teams surrounded by talents where they can hard carry those lower-level teams. The problem is, TyLoo came to the West, had some upset performances, had some big performances, beat Luminosity, beat Na'Vi and in Kiev at a Star Series, whole bunch of like pretty decent upsets actually. Yeah, beyond that, no consistency, no deep runs, no really big playoff finishes generally. But you'd think, right, if that's going to happen, surely Fancy One's going to be a major part of it. Surely he's going to be the guy with a plus 25. He's going to be dropping plus 10 on some big team. He's the guy who probably fragged outright for these upsets. Not really, quite frankly. In fact, when he came to the West, he didn't really do a whole lot of shit. And then over the years, even domestically, he didn't really keep a pace as like the best player in the region. Now there was plenty of players who got to his level, not even just Chinese players. We're talking about the likes of Benta, who quite frankly are much superior players overall in most areas of the game, much more well-rounded players. So him leaving, I think, actually was a temporary boon for TyLoo, that they got past this guy who was kind of fool's gold as a star player, as a superstar from the region. He went off elsewhere, didn't impress that much, still put up some good numbers, still is one of the better Chinese players in terms of stats. My issue is this. Okay, yes, he was super overrated in the early days. So at the same time, don't write him off now and make it like he's absolute trash. Definitely not. He is one of the better Chinese players. I do think he is one of the players most notably that it makes sense he had his problems, because I think he had a lot of issues against better players and played differently and simply was not as effective. I do still think he can be good though, and in this team, he doesn't even have to be the best player. He doesn't have to be a primary focal point in the team. He can be just another player, and we know he's got some firepower. So the really exciting thing about this move is the firepower upgrade. Because okay, Sommer or AttackeR versus DD, it's not a massive firepower upgrade. It is a bit in terms of stats for Sommer over DD, but when I watch like their actual play in the server and what they brought, not a massive deal, but clearly either of them over Captain Moore is definitely an upgrade in 2019 in terms of firepower. This brings in an aggressive player in AttackeR. It's exciting for TyLoo because it now turbocharges a lineup that I already called like an upset machine. Because no, it's not that they would upset consistently or all the time. It's that you just knew if they go to a tournament, at least one map, they're going to have a massive chance at an upset. And usually they would get one map upset, a best of one upset. The problem is they could never get to series play. When they got into series play, they need upsets on 2 of 3 maps then, because they're still underdogs. So they never really were able to do much. They were just a one-off upset. And because they weren't consistent enough, they actually didn't warrant putting in massive amounts of preparation for, or trying to riddle out how they play. Because unless you're the team who gets unlucky that they upset you, they tend to get rolled over quite easily. They can also be smashed 16-2 by teams that aren't even considered top-level teams and nowhere near the top 10 in the rankings. So turbocharging a team that, for me, already played off firepower, played off being aggressive, unpredictable, forcing aim duels, collapsing onto a site immediately, so there aren't a lot of decisions and team play elements combined. It just becomes a DM. This makes it more of that, which is exactly what I want from TyLoo. It's one of the reasons why I always called them in 2018 one of the most exciting teams to watch, but I never called them one of the best. They clearly had massive gaping flaws, and those flaws held them back just as much as their strengths allowed them to get as far as they could at times. So I think this is now a much, much more exciting team. It now makes this team more of what they were what they were best at, and less of what they were worst at. So they still aren't a great tactical team. I don't know, with BenTeT and AttackeR in the lineup, who presumably, it seems, don't speak Chinese, whether they'll ever be able to be that sort of a team that can change their style much. But I don't think they need to either. And I think it's very interesting to see, because the other members of the team, somebody is arguably the best Chinese player. If not the best, okay, people might have better stats than him. He's the most impactful. He's the player where, if you play around his style, for me, his style defines TyLoo. And I'm so glad they went to that style, because as a result, in their big games, he's the one who shines now in the upsets. Like, this guy's AK, when he runs in, his aggressive play, it's really thrilling to see. And it's effective as well when the team plays that style together. BenTeT and AttackeR have been a revelation, a breath of fresh air, all the cliches to the Chinese scene. Obviously, they're not Chinese players, they're from Indonesia. BenTeT, with his raw fragging ability, his well-rounded game, and then, surprisingly, his ability to shot call this very aggressive, burst onto the site style, low utility style of play, but an effective one, and get some upsets. And then AttackeR, who could have ever expected this? This guy, he's not a world-class AWPer, but he uses the AWP effectively. He wins clutches. He seems to have a real head for the game. He actually has some decent skills, even though they're not fabulous skills. Plays well under pressure. Obviously, he combos with BenTeT. They're from the same area. I think this is a team that, I like the lineup. I think it's exciting. I think this might actually be the time when TyLoo legitimately can make a run at cracking that top 10 in the world rankings. Because at the moment, it's not going to happen, and they probably need a one-off run. But with this lineup, hey, now it's starting to get so that it's not ridiculous. Now it's starting to get so you should start to actually expect upsets each tournament. I mean, it's going to take a while and doing a lot of them before they stop being upsets. But at the moment, I'm really excited to see this team against anyone outside the top 5. And if it's the right map, we've seen they can sometimes go head-to-head with those top teams. So this, for me, now is, unlike TyLoo in the past, unlike Flash Gaming, this is a true, at least approaching, super team of the Chinese/Asian region. And as a result, I'm really excited to watch this team play. This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Andreas, Snazore Westerlund, Gardner Wilson, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, James Harding, Kyla Harris, Travis Greb, Daniel Yordanov, and as always, a special thanks goes out to Jerky's Minion. Would you like to suggest a topic or a guest for some of my upcoming content? Perhaps you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA. Do you want to see some teasers? See who's going to be the next guest on one of my shows? Maybe you want to take part in an esports discussion with me. Well, put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.